Hello, everyone. As you all know, we do our wake-up call session every week. But given the particular situation right now in the Middle East, we decided to do a special edition in order to help our followers and everybody who is online to understand the situation a little bit better. And therefore, I'm particularly glad to welcome Shany Mor, who is adjunct fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democraties, lecturer at IDC Herzliya and other universities. Hi, Shany.
Good afternoon.
Shany, let me start right away. You are an astute observer, not only about the situation, of course, on the ground, because you actually are in Israel, but also about how the international community has been covering the latest conflict. And you actually wrote an article about that. Could you share with us a little bit the perspective on how you see the commentators, the press, covering the current situation and the current conflict between Israel and Hamas?
Most of the time, I don't feel that they're covering the current situation, the current conflict at all, but projecting onto us a bunch of their own historical demons and categories. I think that's a dead end for having a conversation about the situation. I think it's a dead end for formulating coherent policies about the situation. One of the things that's so central to what's happening here that's so difficult sometimes to convey is that there actually is a conflict. There is an Arab-Israeli conflict. There has been one for nearly a century. The contours of the conflict and the issues at stake aren't terribly mysterious. Zionist Jews settled here and endeavored to form an independent state, a sovereign state that would solve the Jewish problem once and for all. And most of the Arab world united in opposition to any kind of sovereign Jewish presence in the Middle East. Over that question have been fought numerous wars, some interstate wars, and some waves of violence right here in this country with, and it's hard to say perhaps this week, but with a decreasing intensity over time if we zoom out and look across the decades. What we get instead are a bunch of ill-fitting categories and concepts like colonialism, imperialism, settler colonialism, and heaven forbid, apartheid on a situation that it doesn't fit at all. We also get an almost obsessive repetition of the word occupation. Occupation isn't a moral status, it's a legal status after a conflict in a piece of territory. We talk about the occupation without ever actually explaining two very important things: why it started and why it's still there, at least in the West Bank. It started because there was an Israeli victory and an Arab defeat in a military confrontation in 1967, where the aim of the Arab states was to destroy Israel. And unlike any other occupation, which is the result of a change of territory after a war that's ultimately resolved diplomatically, usually with a new line, generally to the benefit of the side that won the war, and a withdrawal from all other occupied territory, what sustained the occupation for 53 years in the West Bank was that there never was a diplomatic settlement, precisely because the Arab side rejected any kind of diplomatic engagement with Israel for many, many years. That wall of rejection started slowly crumbling in the 1970s with the treaty with Egypt, and in the 1990s with the treaty with Jordan, and even more dramatically perhaps in the last year with 4 new Israeli-Arab peace treaties, but it hasn't yet crumbled on the Palestinian front. In Gaza, the situation is even more extreme because there isn't actually even an occupation. Israel withdrew from 80% of the Gaza Strip in 1994 in the terms of the Oslo Agreement, and withdrew from the remaining 20%, that is to say from 100% of the Gaza Strip in 2005, unilaterally, did not get anything in exchange, did not get peace in exchange, did sign an agreement with the EU and with the Palestinian Authority called the Movement and Access Accords Agreement of 2005, regulating a bunch of the exchanges across the border. But there has not been any Israeli soldier or civilian in Gaza in 16 years. So to speak of this as some kind of after effect of the occupation just shows us how empty that word has become in this discussion.
Now, is there anything particularly about this conflict that we are currently going through? We have here in Europe, as you probably see, it's portrayed as if it started basically all in Sheikh Jarrah, that it's all about East Jerusalem. Is there anything sort of particularly different, or that in sort of in the way it's covered that you are seeing right now in Europe, or is there anything particular?
I know it's very fashionable to say that there are things that are very different. I'm not sure I ever see the difference. I have to be honest with you. I have lived through these escalations so many times. And as I think I said to you when we spoke earlier this week, I have realized that I am doomed to relive in terms of a public discussion, not in terms of the event itself, of course, but I'm on a doom loop of either the 1996 tunnel riots or the 2002 Jenin massacre. Supposedly, every single one of these big media feeding frenzies on Israel always reverts to one of those two forms. It's either the story of some horrible Jewish affront on a holy Muslim site, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which ends up being not true, completely false, 100% fabricated, but then we're lectured about how, well, you shouldn't have done something that was provocative, that could have been interpreted, that whatever, speaks of the other side as though they're an uncontrollable mass of people with the maturity of children rather than adult political actors. Nobody ever talks about Jews being provoked in the same sense. Or it's the story of some Israeli atrocity that people are angry about, and then when you study it for a few days, you realize that most of that story was completely fabricated as well. And we live through this pretty regularly every 3 or 4 years, something that looks like the Jenin massacre or something that looks like the tunnel riots. In the case of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there's something about this that's people struggle to come to terms with, which is that Israel conquers the old city of Jerusalem in 1967, liberates the holiest site in Judaism after 2,000 years of longing, the Temple Mount, and then hands the keys back to the Islamic Trust. Never claims it as a Jewish site, never builds a synagogue there. In fact, for most of the last 54 years, bans Jews from even visiting there for most hours of the week, and completely bans any kind of Jewish religious ritual there. Nothing like that has ever happened in the history of nations in conflict or in the history of holy sites being conquered from one side or another. It's not just incredible, people use that word as a metaphor, it's literally incredible in the sense that Israel's enemies and even many of its friends actually don't believe it's happened, which is why every 5, 6, 7 years you get another story about how supposedly Israel is endangering the Muslim holy sites, and that being used as an excuse for violence against Israelis and Jews around the world. That actually is a type of violence and a type of lie that existed before 1967 and before 1948 for that matter. First time it was around was in 1928, where a lie about Jews threatening Al-Aqsa was used to mobilize anti-Semitic violence in the Middle East. And it's repeated itself roughly once a decade ever since. Why international observers fall for it every time, I don't know. But also why the people who are carrying out the violence fall for it every time, I don't know. If Jews are constantly threatening Al-Aqsa, how have they not accomplished anything yet?
Now let me turn a little bit inwards. When you look at Israeli society right now, you've had 4 elections in 2 years. You've had a year of mere lockdown because of COVID. Yes, Israel has dealt with that better than any other country, but nevertheless, it was a tough time. Now you have this conflict, but also internal tensions within Israel. Could you tell us a little bit sort of what is the general Israeli state of mind, and what do you think this means for the future? Where are you going from now?
It would be reckless for me to hazard a guess about the future. I will say that whenever there have been Jewish-Arab tensions in this country, before statehood or after, there's an interesting pattern of there are explosions of violence. I'll backtrack. There are explosions of violence or some kind of war roughly once a decade, sometimes twice a decade. They fit certain patterns on their own. Where Israel is strong is what it does in between the wars. I mean, that's the difference between us and our neighbors, is what we accomplish in the 8 or 9 years of quiet in between each explosion. I think that was certainly true in the last decade here in Israel, and presumably will be true in the decade that comes after this as well. In terms of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel, and again, this is true before statehood as well as after, there have been explosions of violence that left an enormous scar. And there have been violent episodes that once they were over, everyone returned back to normal. I don't know that there's a good explanation for which one falls into one category or the other. There have been violent episodes that left a real rupture that was never healed. And then, like I said, there have been other ones where the moment the violence ended, it took a couple weeks, a couple months, and things went back to normal. I hope very much that this is from the second category. I won't make a prediction, but I will give you the reasons why I'm a bit optimistic. The level of integration and mutual care between the two communities inside Israel in the last couple of years, but in particular in the COVID crisis, was almost unprecedented. What you see today in Israel between Arabs and Jews is far from some kind of idyllic coexistence, that's for sure. There are still enormous gaps to be closed, and there's still an enormous amount of reconciliation that's necessary between the two communities. But the numbers of people who work together, who travel together, who use public transport together, who interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, not just in hierarchical forms, you know, middle-class Jews going to an Arab restaurant and being served by a waiter. That's not what I'm talking about. Today you have Arabs and Jews working together in high tech, Arabs and Jews working together and studying together in universities in numbers that are unprecedented. Arabs on Hebrew language media in numbers that were completely unimaginable as recently as 5 years ago. There's been a big mental break that was broken. If you ask me what was the political event that precipitated it, it wasn't anything that happened in Israeli domestic politics. It was 2011. It was the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring caused a gigantic mental rupture for a sizable section of the Arab minority in Israel. And the truth is that Arabs in Israel have a different life. It's a different life even than Palestinians just across the Green Line, and certainly much different than Arabs in any of Israel, in any of the neighboring Arab states. When I'm traveling abroad, which is something we used to do before COVID, if I see an Israeli Jew, I can always recognize them. That's easy. But if I see Israeli Arabs, I recognize them too. I mean, they even if they're speaking Arabic, from far away, I can see that it's somebody who's Israeli. And if I get closer to them, I, as someone who doesn't understand much Arabic, will always notice that in every single sentence, there's at least one or two Hebrew words. Whether it's the description of something on the phone or about the air conditioner, about whatever, it's impossible. So we have a shared life and a shared existence, with an enormous amount of work to go. What's happened in the last week is absolutely heartbreaking. Not just in Lod, but throughout, in places like Akko, in Yafo, where I live. I hope very much that the damage that was done can be reversed. And like I said, I'm not predicting, but I'm reasonably optimistic that this will be one of the times where things can bounce back in a way that wasn't really the case, I think, in 2000, and certainly was not the case in 1987.
What about the view about the conflict on the Israeli side? Where's the state of mind right now? I know you're not a pollster, but what do Israelis think about this current situation and where the potentials are for peace?
I think the consensus view in Europe and North America among a certain kind of center-left is that the thing that we need to work for right now is for what we might call an end to the occupation, but basically an Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and the establishment of a Palestinian state there. If you want to come and tell Israelis that they should leave the West Bank, and that once they do, it won't just become a base of operations for Hamas, it won't become a launching pad for rockets, and that if heaven forbid it did, the whole world, including all of the liberal newspapers and human rights organizations, will stand by us, you will not find, I think, more than 10 people in the entire country to believe you. I don't think anybody in Israel, I'm not even talking about the Israeli right. There is nobody in Israel right now who wants to have the West Bank turn into Gaza. And there is nobody, if they're being honest, who believes that we have any potential for preventing that if there's a withdrawal of Tzahal from the West Bank. And certainly nobody has any illusions about where all of the righteous thinkers and speakers of the North Atlantic countries will be in the event that we are attacked from there. Where does that put us? I don't know. I'm still a believer that the only way of ensuring Israel's continued existence as a Jewish and democratic state is for us to somehow find a way out of the West Bank. I don't know exactly how we're going to be able to do it. I don't think we're going to be doing it in one grand gesture of peacemaking. I certainly don't think we're going to be doing it in response to any kind of international pressure. I suspect the best thing that we can do in the coming decade is small steps that reduce the footprint of the occupation, certainly reduce the footprint of the civilian settlement enterprise, and bring as many international and regional actors in to act as some kind of buffer. I don't think there's any situation where Israel will leave the West Bank as it did Gaza, and I don't think there's any situation where Israel will withdraw even partially in the West Bank as it did in the 1990s in exchange for a promised future mutual recognition, which never comes.
Thank you very much, Shany, for having taken the time. I know it's a very peculiar moment right now for everybody in Israel. So really, thank you very much for this. And I'm sure our audience will greatly enjoy it.
Thank you. It was very, very nice to speak with you.